I have something a little different for you today, my curious friends. This video is sponsored by the Herbert Westcote Memorial Library of MacArthur, Ohio. About 250 years ago, in almost exactly this location, the Boston Tea Party took place. Tea, taxes, revolution. You know the story, right? But today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look. Come with me. First thing to know is that the British Empire in the middle of the 1700s was becoming a global endeavor. In a century, it had gone from a minor figure in Europe to an empire that stretched from North America to India. And a big part of our Tea Party story has nothing to do with America. Let's talk about the East India Company. The East India Company was a private company that was given a charter to establish trade with the East Indies, a term that basically referred to India and most of East Asia. In return for spending money to establish trade, they would be granted the greatest enticement imaginable, a monopoly on the most valuable goods in the world, including silks, spices, and tea. When Europeans first started getting access to tea, this Chinese delicacy was a sensation and an expensive luxury. Drunk in fine imported porcelain, sweetened with sugar and poured from a silver pot. But as time went on, the East India Company shipped enough tea that it became a luxury that everyone could afford. Americans were particularly fond of tea because it helped us feel like we were connected to Britain and the rest of the world. You see, here in Boston, most of us were born here and had never been to England. But we were raised to believe that as British people, we were the most free and freedom-loving people in the world. But in the 1760s, the British government started making choices that left us feeling like second-class citizens. We feared they were trying to rob us of our rights. We organized protests against the hated policies like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. Both the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts were opposed by the American colonists because they were a violation of the norm. The colonies had mostly been left in their first centuries to their own affairs, electing their own local governments and passing their own taxes to fund their local initiatives. But now Parliament was stepping in. The British government, they thought, did not even have the right to tax them since they didn't have representatives in Parliament. You've heard the phrase before, no taxation without representation. But since the British government did not agree with the principle of the matter, they simply looked for different ways to get the colonies to accept their authority, which is why they next turned to the Tea Act. Normally all tea had to be shipped to England first, where taxes were paid on it. Then American merchants would buy that tea, bring it to America, where taxes were paid on it again. Then it could be sold to retailers and to the public. But the Tea Act made it so that merchants could act as agents of the East India Company, waiving the fees for landing the tea in England and selling it essentially directly in America. Since the East India Company would hand-pick its agents in America, it meant that some wealthy, well-connected people were going to profit by this act, as well as helping the East India Company out. But Boston was under special pressure. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was determined to see government authority upheld. These protesters, he thought, could not win again. The ships did arrive and make port in Boston. And once they had landed, they were legally forbidden from leaving until their goods had been cleared. Bostonian dock workers were united in refusing to unload the tea, but government officials of the customs agency could seize the tea if it was not unloaded in a certain amount of time. So with the clock ticking, Bostonians began to hold large public meetings to discuss what should be done. On the night before government officials would be allowed to seize the tea and force it ashore, one last meeting was held in Boston's largest building, the Old South Meeting House. Men of the town gathered there for what looked like a town meeting. The meeting went on for hours as they waited for the governor's final response on whether or not he would allow these ships to leave. And when his refusal came, chaos broke out. There was some talk of Mohawks, and thousands of people poured out of the meeting house, going toward Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 ships lied at anchor. Splitting up into orderly parties, showing that this had been planned ahead of time. About 150 men went to board the 3 vessels, the Eleanor, the Dartmouth, and the Brig Beaver, a replica of which stands right behind me. On the ships, this crowd surged forward, disguised with Native American disguises, Mohawks they called themselves. This disguise was both to hide their appearance and to add symbolism of something that represented America to them. With hatchets in their hands, as well as a few cutlasses and pistols concealed on their persons, they stormed aboard. The captains of these vessels had no incentive to resist this armed crowd boarding their vessel, so they stood aside as the tea destroyers went into the holds of the ships to haul up the tea chests. The chests themselves ranged up to 400 pounds in weight, solidly built from poplar and spruce. They were hauled out efficiently in an organized way that showed that this was a town of dock workers and seafaring men. They hauled the chests up and tore off the canvas wrappers. The chests themselves were made of wood, lined inside with a thin lead foil to keep the tea fresh. Chopping through and peeling back, they revealed this loose leaf tea, its intoxicating aroma no doubt pouring out. They dumped the tea into the water. In some cases, they had to bail it out with their hands because the chests were too heavy to lift and tip over the side. But they emptied every last chest and tossed the empty chests over the side to get them out of the way as they brought more and more chests to the side. This hard work would have taken as much as 3 hours to complete. But even that is pretty impressive, given the sheer volume of tea that was being destroyed. So much so that they ran into a problem. The tide was extremely low, only a few feet of water and mud below these ships. Not quite the picturesque scene one might picture. In fact, the tea was piling up in mounds so high that it was beginning to spill back into the ships. Some of the younger men were dispatched over the side to see to it that the tea was stamped into the mud and every last leaf destroyed. The destruction was total. The ship's decks were even swept clean to make sure that not a single leaf escaped destruction. This was all done to send a message, and a message it sent. 92,000 pounds of loose leaf tea were destroyed. In our time, that was around 9,659 British pounds. That's around $1 million in today's money. It took more than a month for the news to reach England, and more than a month for the news to travel back by ship. But when the response came from Parliament, it was decisive. Parliament had had enough of Boston's antics. They decided that Boston needed to pay, literally. Until the price of this tea had been repaid to the East India Company, Boston would face a series of punishments, including the closure of its port. No more ships could come and go from Boston. That cut off the lifeblood of Boston's economy, making the repayment of that sum practically impossible. Furthermore, they passed acts curtailing Massachusetts government. No more could they have their town meetings to decide their affairs, and no more would they have an appointed civilian governor. Instead, their new governor would be General Thomas Gage, and an army of thousands upon thousands would be sent to get Boston under control. They hoped to crush the rebellious spirit in Boston, but this heavy-handed set of measures would cause anger across the 13 colonies. All of them would begin to meet together to discuss how to respond. This was the beginning of the Continental Congress, which would eventually pass the Declaration of Independence. And what's more, only less than a year from when the tea was destroyed, armed rebellion would begin in Massachusetts at Lexington and Concord in 1775. But who was really behind it? The people who went out to destroy this tea swore themselves to secrecy. On one hand, they might have feared reprisal, but they kept that secret long after the events had passed. It wasn't until they were old men that some of them began to tell the story. John Hancock, John Adams, Samuel Adams, none of them were present for the destruction of the tea. Ordinary people, like you and me, saw to the tea's destruction. They rose up as a community to take action, and it changed the course of history. The story eventually broke, not until many involved were dead and those who remained were old and fading from the world. But the story was first broken in Ohio, in fact, by a man named Joshua Wyeth, a Bostonian by birth who had moved to the West. That's what they thought of Ohio as at the time. And there he was separated from the peer pressure of keeping the secret in Boston and wanted to tell people of what he had done. He had been a young blacksmith's apprentice at the time. It is in the account of Joshua Wyeth that we first see this event being called the Boston Tea Party. With some distance from the event, they could have a laugh about it and call it a tea party. But it's important to remember that this was an act of mass destruction of private property. Yes, it did belong to the East India Company, not to the Crown. And that's just a quick look at the story of the Boston Tea Party. If you have questions or things you want to know more about, please let me know in the comments below. And as this is YouTube, I have to remind you that if you like the video, give it a thumbs up or hit that subscribe button. Now, until the next time, stay curious, my friends.